Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you everyone for joining. We are so pleased to have so many folks that are interested in participating with us and joining us for this truly informational session Marty has planned for us today. But before we get started and before I introduce Marty, I just wanted to take a moment for those of you that are not aware that APT is a membership organization and we provide a number, or we will provide and have provided a number of presentations like this one today. And the future programming will only be available to APT members in the future. We've updated the website for all upcoming presentations, so it will be available to all members on the portal for folks to register. We will also send the link through the APT listserv. Anyone joining APT will be added to the listserv, where we will have an opportunity to share information and ask questions, much like the PSNT listserv that you probably are currently a member of. We want to go ahead and thank our founding supporters who have contributed in a very significant way to help us get APT up and running to this point. So kudos to you all that joined as supporting members. We also want to thank all of those that joined us as members, as well as supporters or sponsor supporters at that level. Going forward, we want to remind everyone that, of course, it is never too late to join. We are, if you go to our website at www.aptrusts.org, you will find the details for the new opportunities that you have to either become a member or become a supporter of APT. The general membership is currently $500. If you join now, this will take you through to 2024. Same with the new allied professionals membership we have for anyone who is perhaps not a pooled special needs trust, but you are an allied professional that you engage pooled special needs trust, or you work with other organizations and or you choose to support us in different ways. You have an opportunity to join as an allied professional at two levels. A silver level at $500 a year, and then the gold level at $1,500. Of course, if you go to our website, you can look at the details of each of those memberships and supporting levels for you to make a decision. So thank you for letting me do that little commercial. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce this fabulous woman, Marty Ford. She is the Senior Advisor for Public Policy at the ARC of the United States. She joined the ARC Public Policy team in 1984. For 8 years until 2019, she led the policy team representing the ARC on Capitol Hill and before federal agencies through 6 years of the Obama administration and the first 2 years of the Trump administration. She is a recognized leader in federal public policy affecting people with disabilities, with over 35 years of experience in long-term services and supports, Medicaid, as well as Social Security disability issues. She has testified numerous times before Congress and has been a resource to the press many times throughout her years of work on behalf of people with IDD. I can go on and on. I'm not going to bore you because there's a lot to share about Marty's accomplishments, and not that it would bore you, but I think the more important thing, you all can read. We're all professionals. Please, I encourage you to look at her full bio. But one of the things that I did want to share is the reason we invited Marty to share with us today is because, and I referenced this to Marty, like the song from Hamilton, The Room Where It Happens. Marty was in the room when SNTs and PSNTs were birthed. She was integral in ensuring that SNTs and PSNTs were part of the statute that we all now know as over 93. She has a unique perspective, and we know the information she shares today will enlighten and remind us of why we do what we do and the important role we play in the lives of people with disabilities. So as I share my screen, I want to welcome Marty, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Yolanda. I am going to do the historical perspective on how the pooled trust came about, and what the context was when this developed. I think it helps any of you who are working in this area to know that, to understand why they look like they do, what their character and personality came from, where they came from. I think that helps everyone. I will say that one of my colleagues, I hope, is going to join about halfway through the group, because she will be working on this area from now on, and but she has a conflict that keeps her busy until around 1:30. Someone is doing the slides for me. Is that you, Yolanda? Okay, so next slide, please. Thank you. So how did all this come about? First of all, just to say, I'm talking about what happened before the pooled trust became an official part of Medicaid, and I'm not covering case law. I'm talking about where these came from and what I see for the future. Long before over 93, Congress was becoming increasingly concerned about the growing industry to assist elders in protecting their assets and becoming Medicaid eligible. And Congress took a series of steps to curb these efforts. And they were, when I was doing some research to make sure that I had all the right laws and their titles and their dates and everything, I came across a law review article that was very helpful in putting that all in place. And I've listed that for you here. And it takes it up to 1995, which is all I needed because I just wanted to go to 1993. So if you're ever interested, it's not behind a paywall. It was easy to Google it. And there it is. And I will say that I know some people get irritated when you see PowerPoints with lots of words, and some of you may come away saying, it looks like she read her PowerPoint. I happen to like to have PowerPoints that have more detail in them than just 3 words, because it's too hard for me to take notes from people who are talking fast and I can't get all the details that I want. So I'm actually going to give you my notes on the PowerPoint, although I will say more than actually shows on the page. So next slide, please. The first was what we call Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1980, OBRA 80, was when Congress allowed states to deny Medicaid eligibility to people who transferred countable assets for less than fair market value within the last 24 months. And I'm sure you all know what countable assets are. They're the ones that are not excluded. The excluded ones being things like your own home if you're living in it, a burial space, burial funds, a car under a certain amount. Those kinds of things are excluded. The countable assets they were looking at this time, and it was for less than fair market value. Oh, good. Looks like Darcy's on now. Darcy Milburn, who is here now on the line. And states could also make people ineligible for up to 24 months. So this was the first attempt to start curbing these efforts. Didn't take long. Next slide. Congress wasn't very happy, and they came in again in 1982 in what was known as the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982, or TEFRA 82. These bills, by the way, when they say omnibus, and these bills, if you can see me on the screen, sometimes they were huge, and Congressman Waxman was often teased if you were on one side of the aisle, or ridiculed if you were on the other side of the aisle, for how thick and large these bills were. But they did a lot of other things, and from our perspective, they did a lot of good things. The TEFRA legislation had some excellent things in there for children. Anyway, in this legislation, TEFRA allowed the states to also consider transfers of any excluded assets. So Congress seems to be getting a bit irritated and is now allowing excluded assets to be counted, and in the 24 months before determination of Medicaid eligibility. It also allowed states to impose liens on the homes of institutionalized people to allow recovery of Medicaid expenditures made on their behalf. But it did prohibit the states from foreclosing on the liens if a spouse, child, or other primary caregiver still lived there. So now that was 1982. The next slide, we're jumping to 1988, but don't think there's a 6-year hiatus there. I'm coming back in a little bit. We're still talking asset transfers here. I'll get back to a bill that came in between, but right now I'm talking asset transfers. And here we have the Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act of 1988. The letters are MECA, but it was never called MECA in Washington. It's called Catastrophic Coverage, or the Catastrophic Act. For a lot of reasons, it's considered catastrophic. This, you can see Congress is definitely angry. It's like a parent, three chances to the child. This time it mandated that all states adopt the asset transfer rules that had previously been optional under earlier legislation. And it extended the 24-month look-back period for asset transfers to 30 months. And any asset transfers made in the 30-month period before the application would be considered available resources for Medicaid eligibility determination. And it required all countable assets of the applicant and the spouse to be totaled and divided equally for determining Medicaid eligibility. That was known as spousal impoverishment, and it was supposed to keep the community spouse or the non-institutionalized spouse financially secure. Again, asset transfers. Now that was 1988. They came back in 1989 for a technical correction in OBRA 89. Congress enacted a technical correction to the Catastrophic Act to restrict asset transfers by applicants' spouses. This closed a major loophole where an applicant could transfer their assets to a spouse, who in turn then transferred the assets to someone else without penalty. So you could see that there was an awful lot of planning going on. Everybody's looking for loopholes, and everybody's trying to find a way to allow these elderly folks to transfer their assets to make someone eligible for Medicaid, and keep these keep the funding, the finances available to heirs. Now back to the bill that came out in that 6-year hiatus. The next, oh, thank you. This is Congress responds to the use of trusts in asset planning back in 1985, COBRA 85. And this is where any non-testamentary trust or trust-like device, which might have been an annuity, established by the individual or the spouse, where the individual might be a beneficiary and the trustee has discretion over the distribution, would be considered available to the Medicaid applicant, regardless of the trust provisions. This was termed a Medicaid qualifying trust, which was always confusing to everybody that was dealing with this at the time, because in fact, it was a Medicaid disqualifying trust. It was called a Medicaid qualifying trust because that's what people thought they were doing. They thought they were qualifying for Medicaid at the time, when in fact they were disqualifying themselves based on the legislation. This particular piece of legislation was considered in many ways to have fostered the growth in the industry for more intricate ways around the new and more complex restrictions. and supplemental needs trusts, which could not pay for the individual's essential support, gained traction around this time as an approach to dealing with ways of helping people. And these are very important for folks with IDD. So I'm going to stop here for a second and make some general observations about what was going on at the time when we stepped in. Just some general observations. Who was pushing for all these changes? Where were the Democrats? Where were the Republicans? Who supported Medicaid? Who supported building assets and use of trusts? In general, you're wondering, the Democrats were in control of both the House and the Senate for a good deal of this. Why were they constricting things so much? Well, in general, the Democrats supported the Medicaid program because they were supporting people who were very low income, and they believed that the Medicaid program was for people with very low incomes, and it shouldn't be opened up to people who had a lot of assets. The funding in Medicaid should be preserved for the people for whom it was intended, and people with very high incomes or high assets should not be using the Medicaid program. That was a very strong conviction on the part of the people that we talked to when we went in to start our discussions. On the other side, and these are very generalized comments. I mean, you could always find differences of opinion, but in general, the Republicans were not as supportive of the Medicaid program, but they truly understood trusts and saving for the future, that sort of thing. But the Medicaid program was just not of that much interest to them. And if they were going to go in and make changes to Medicaid, it wasn't to really improve it. It was they would rather make cutbacks in the program. So there wasn't a lot of middle ground here in where we were trying to get. Although at the time, 30 plus years ago, Congress could still work in a very bipartisan manner. And so there wasn't a lot of middle ground in the basic beliefs about Medicaid or trusts and savings for the future, but there was still an ability to work in a bipartisan manner. So where we did find some support, at least in getting into the key offices of the Democrats on how to address protecting what had been longstanding efforts on the part of families to protect their children and their minor and adult children, was that they didn't want to disturb long-standing practices of families to plan for the future. So that gets us to getting into some of the specifics of OBRA 93 and how we were able to work in that context. But let me start with a little bit of what happened, why OBRA 93 came about. Congress was again reacting strongly to attempt to severely cut or curb efforts to circumvent Medicaid eligibility rules. And I haven't been able to find anything in writing anywhere about this story, but it was out there at the time in 92 and 93. The Chairman Waxman of the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment was on an airplane back from California to Washington and picked up Business Week and read an article yet again about how to get around the new Medicaid rules on trusts and transfers of assets. And he came back into the office with that article and said, this is it. We're going to just stop this altogether. We are going to end all of this. We're going to close the loopholes. We are just going to shut this down. And everybody's scrambling around out in the advocacy community, the folks working for the elderly, the folks, those of us paying attention to this from the disability perspective. We're thinking, oh my gosh, this is something that families do in terms of planning for their minor and adult children. So the attempt from the committee was they actually, in OBRA 93, did revise many of the financial eligibility requirements for the Medicaid needy category. They amended many rules regarding resources and the establishment of trusts and transfer of assets. They expanded the definition of assets. They extended the look-back period for asset transfers to 36 months. They exempted certain asset transfers. They comprehensively restructured the treatment of trusts. They increased potential penalties for attempted asset sheltering, and they expanded the government's right to recover from a beneficiary's estate. It was very comprehensive. And frankly, I am not an expert in everything they did in OBRA 93 that affected all of the efforts of people working on behalf of folks over 65. But next slide, please. Given the determination of the chairman of the subcommittee on health and the environment, we were concerned about the potential for changes that would catastrophically affect people with disabilities based on the rules changes that would affect asset transfers that parents use for their children's futures. So the ARC primarily, and then with help from folks at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, and I'll stop here for 1 second. I have to say that many advocates in the disability community also were quite lukewarm about this. As I described, Democrats were very lukewarm because they didn't think people with assets belonged in Medicaid. They didn't quite understand where we were coming from about parents' concerns about their children's futures after the parents themselves died. So there really wasn't a groundswell of folks working on this back in 92, 93, actually mostly 93. But anyway, so it was a very, very small, meaning 2 people were working on this. And we met with key members, committee staff, about the important future planning aspects that trusts allowed. And families could, at that time, supplement Medicaid during their lifetimes, and they used trusts to supplement after their death. And these trusts were also acknowledged and accepted by SSI at the time. Pooled trust at the time existed in about 30 states, and some had existed for at least 30 years. Many at the time required a percentage of the remainder to remain in the trust after the beneficiary's death. And they ranged around 10, 15%, maybe 20%. There was one state that we know required 50% to remain in the trust. That was the highest that we knew of. But we worked with the staff of the House Energy and Commerce Committee's Subcommittee on Health and the Environment and the House and the Senate Finance Committee, but primarily the House staff. As a result, next slide, thank you. You're ahead of me, thank you, Yolanda. The OBRA 93 provisions for people with disabilities are narrow exceptions to the new, much harsher penalties on asset transfers and use of trusts to qualify for Medicaid. And there are essentially 2 major exceptions. And these, I use the Social Security Act sites because that's what we use in Washington, basically. And the first one is Section 1917 C2B that we actually don't talk a lot about, but this is the one that protects the eligibility of the individual who transfers assets to a D4 trust for the individual's child or for an individual under 65 who is disabled. And notably, when you transfer to a person under 65 who is disabled, that doesn't have to be a family member or a child or anything else. That's very critical because if that person who does the transfer ultimately needs Medicaid themselves, that transfer is protected. So that's an important piece that we don't focus on a lot. It's not discussed a lot, but it's important. And then the second piece was the 1917 D4A and C trusts. There is a B trust. It's a Miller trust. It affects mostly elderly people in nursing homes. We don't talk about those a lot, but the D4A and C trusts are the ones that I'll concentrate on. They're the ones exempt from the strict new rules and affect people primarily with disabilities. I think of it as affecting people with IDD, but they affect anyone with disabilities who puts money into a trust. So let's go to the next slide and start with D4A, the individual trust. Now here's where the personality of these trusts really is affected by some things that happened during the work of creating these things. There are three prongs to the individual trust exemption. You have the exemption if you meet the three prongs. The trust contains the assets of the individual, and it's established for the benefit of the individual under age 65, and I'll discuss the 65 later, and you're disabled under the SSI definition. It's established for the benefit of the individual by the individual, and that became effective. The individual was added later, and we'll talk about that. Effective December of 2016. And I'll mention that many of you know that David Goldfarb worked on that when he was with NAILA. He's also now at the ARC. Or a grandparent, parent, legal guardian, or a court. And this is critical. If the state will receive all amounts remaining in the trust on the death of the individual up to an amount equal to the total medical assistance paid on behalf of the individual under the state plan, which we call the Medicaid payback. And I will discuss the Medicaid payback in more detail later. 1917 D4C is the pooled trust, and that has 5 prongs. Contains the assets of an individual, and a key element of that missing is under 65, which I'll discuss later. The trust is established and managed by a nonprofit association. A separate account is maintained for each beneficiary for purposes of investment and management of the funds. The trust pools these accounts. Accounts are established solely for the benefit of the individuals who are disabled by the parent, grandparent, legal guardian, individual, or the court. And again, the payback. But to the extent that amounts remaining in the trust upon the death of the individual of the beneficiary are not retained by the trust, then you have the payback. The trust pays to the state from the remaining amounts, etc. And that to the extent the amounts remaining in the trust upon the death are not retained by the trust, that was the part respecting the practices that had been in place for many years of the pooled trusts. So let me talk about the Medicaid payback provision. The next slide, please. We strongly advocated to ensure that the harsh rules would not harm families paying for the future of their minor children or adult children with severe disabilities. And we made the case that families supplemented SSI and Medicaid benefits because these programs are unable to cover all of an individual's needs over a lifetime. And supplementation is possible while a parent or other family member is living, and families engaged in trust planning to continue supplementation beyond their own deaths. The exceptions allow individuals, families, and others. Remember the part I said about that 1917 C2B is not limited to family members. Others can supplement the services that an individual with disabilities will receive over a lifetime from the SSI and Medicaid programs. The next slide gets into the part about Medicaid not being a clawback. In the negotiations, the Medicaid payback provision was established instead of an upper limit on the amount of the funds that could be placed into a trust by an individual with disabilities for him or herself. Remember, these are first party trusts. Virtually nothing in this affects third party trusts. So the whole point of this was, remember, we are exceptions to all of the efforts to stop elderly people from putting their funds into trusts and protecting their assets for their heirs. So how would the staff on the Hill prevent this from being used again as another way of being used as another loophole? So they thought, okay, well, we'll just put an upper limit on this, and that's fine. So staff suggestions at the time, and they were talking to a lot of the staff on the committee, ranged, and I bet you can't even imagine the range that they talked about. Remember, the resource limits at the time for individuals were $2,000. So some suggestions were that perhaps a range, perhaps a limit would be reasonable at $4,000. Can you imagine these trusts at $4,000 limit? The highest suggested, well, it got to 5 and then 10. The highest suggested amount for the trusts was $20,000. Now, you've seen trusts of $1 million. You've seen people who had needs of $1 million or more. We couldn't talk our way that high. We did. We said, people need more than that. Medicaid doesn't cover everything, and there's lots that happens to people. So staff legitimately thought about that and realized there's no way they could put an upper limit like that in the law. So they were very creative, and they came back with this Medicaid payback. And they said, what about a payback? If this is really a supplement to what Medicaid and SSI can do during life, and you're truly supplementing, you're not using this as a way to get around, somehow or another, using this as a way to put aside a pool of money that's going to go to beneficiaries later. Let's say it's a supplement, and whatever you're not using goes to pay back Medicaid, because otherwise you have a spend down before you're Medicaid eligible. That's what happens now. You spend your money and then you're Medicaid eligible. If you want to spread the money across your lifetime, whatever's left, then you pay back Medicaid. That was a reasonable, negotiated compromise. So Medicaid payback services satisfy policymakers that the funds in the account are designed to supplement the needs of the beneficiary. This is not another device for estate planning. And it's especially important that you could have larger amounts than the highest amounts that were considered at the time, and that the program it satisfies policymakers who are worried about Medicaid serving only those people who have low incomes and resources, that this is not some way of getting around that also. And after the death of the beneficiary, Medicaid programs would be paid back anything left over, up to the value of the services that Medicaid has provided during life. I mean, it's possible that someone has a lot of money, $1 million, but they die 2 months after Medicaid eligibility. So, okay, take the 2 months worth of Medicaid that was used, and the rest goes to the named beneficiary. That's legitimate also. This was considered only fair. And without this agreement, I don't believe the trust exemptions would have survived. So once the agreement was reached, it had to be finalized in legislative language by legislative council. So you've heard the comments about legislation and sausage making are two things you don't want to watch. So there were several glitches in Ober 93 trust language that occurred and attempts to correct errors. But let me describe to you um, the errors that occurred first. These exemptions, first of all, it took a long time to work. Ober 93, as I said, these are huge bills when you get this is the depth of the paper. Well, actually, I think it's shorter than the depth of the paper, but they're monstrous bills. And the biggest issue was getting rid of all the loopholes. Our exemptions from the loopholes were not the first things on their minds. And so getting the exemptions came last. And we saw the draft language for the exemptions very, very late. And we saw the language one time. And I'm not even sure we saw the language. It was read to us over the phone. Remember, this is more than 30 years ago. So we didn't have, we had faxes, but we didn't have the kind of electronics that we have now. The option, the language was fine. It included individuals, it included under 65, it included all of that. The problem was it did not include the option for the pooled trust to retain a percentage of the funds. That was inadvertently missing. So the staff had to take it back to Ledge Council to get that corrected. And when Ledge Council had to add that to the pooled trust part, they split the language into two, into A and C. And inadvertently, individual was inadvertently dropped from D4A, and under 65 was inadvertently dropped from D4C. So that's why you had those differences. But we did get the pooled trust retention of a percentage into the C language. And we had no opportunity to view the language again before the final votes. So when we saw the bill as a final, it was too late. But typically after massive bills were passed, they were often followed by technical corrections bills, and we already discussed one of them, technical corrections to the catastrophic bill. Ober 93 was enacted on August 10th of 1993, amending Medicaid in those days and also today without 60 votes in the Senate requires the annual budget reconciliation process. And that is virtually just not done. After the 94 elections, the Republicans took control of both the House and the Senate, and staff experts on these issues were on the Democratic committee staffs. When you lose control of a House, your staffs on the committees shrink. So you lose people. Opening up Medicaid became risky for many reasons for many years, including the Hyde anti-abortion amendment in place in various forms since 1980. So there are lots and lots of obstacles. You have the politics, you have the shrunken staffs, you have the Hyde Amendment. Corrections to any of these things would have to wait for many, many years. And I mentioned already that it took until, what was it, 2016 to get the individual added back into D4A. So here are some of my comments on what we have left of Ober 93, of what we have of Ober 93. And I'm not talking about case law. I'm talking about pushing the envelope. Many of us are concerned that we have fears that under 65 in pooled trusts, which is a glitch, but it may be too late to fix that glitch because so much case law and state law and everything else has developed since then. The industry has changed. And the retention of 100% of the remainders may be sources for ultimate destruction of these exceptions to the harsh rules and penalties in the law. Obviously, Congress did not want these trusts or any devices used for people over 65 or for people who became eligible over 65. Over and over and over again, Congress stepped in to fix the problems. In addition of people over 65 using loopholes. In addition, the lure of unlimited trust remainders, I believe, is also a problem. The intent of the remainders, as told to Congress, was to assist in providing services to people who outlived their funds and to provide advocacy services to people who were indigent and did not have funds in the pooled trust. I think they're being used for other things these days also. And in addition to that, in economic downturns, states have become very vocal and put extreme pressure on their congressional delegations to get at that money. Medicaid paid back for services for someone with available funds, and it is not being paid back. The Medicaid programs are stressed. The states are stressed in those situations especially during economic downturns, and they see that money sitting there, and it's not always being used for people. It's being used for administration of nonprofits, and that is not what it was intended for. I believe the industry must manage, control, and police itself to avoid the worst that these loopholes would allow. Otherwise, extreme behaviors are going to attract the press and congressional attention, which would bring the downfall that severely limits or ends the use of these important planning tools for people with disabilities. I know I'm the skunk at the picnic. I know lots of people don't like me saying this stuff, but I just take a look at the history of what has happened to the planning for the elderly before over 93. And if that's the kind of thing that we see happening with the over 93, what we call the over 93 trusts, then we can expect the same thing to happen to our little piece of this world. So that's mine, Yolanda. I don't know how you want to handle conversation or Q&A or whatever. Thank you. I'm going to take a swig of water.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Marty. That was just so informative. And I know there probably are questions. I'm thinking that everyone on this call, especially your last comments, sort of got a chill, maybe something running up the back of our necks, because we recognize that we want to, as far as APT is concerned, and Steve, you might want to unmute your phone just in case you want to add anything to this, as well as Megan as the vice president. Megan is our vice president and Steve is our president. But I think one of the things that we are committed to doing as far as APT is concerned is to make sure that we create standards, help create standards that we all can live by to ensure that we can live another day into the future without drawing negative attention to trust, so that we can continue the work that we've started with people with disabilities. So Steve, I know you have something that you want to share before we get into questions.
Well, Yolanda, I'll try to do something that is hard for me. I'll try to be brief and to the point. But first off, Marty, you are such an incredible advocate. And I think this just demonstrates just a very small amount of your work over the years and, how you've influenced things, not only for persons with developmental disabilities, but the entire community. And I, for myself, I've heard part of this presentation before, but I think it is really important to understand how did this happen. And we hear all the time about, well, what was the congressional intent? And I think this is very useful. the very reason why we put APT together wasn't just because, well, we just really need another organization or whatever. We are an unregulated industry. And Marty, I absolutely share your concern, because all we need is one bad actor, real or perceived, here, to really bring down the ire of Congress, because Congress can give and Congress can take away. The other thing with this, and I think this is something for us all to understand, is that in order to do this, we cannot do this alone here. And we really need very strong partnerships with organizations like the ARC here, NAILA, and all the disability organizations, to make sure that we really focus on what we're really supposed to be focusing on, which is how to make sure that we have a strong pooled trust community that actually serves the persons with disabilities that we're set up to serve, and not, whether real or perceived, to be using these as a shill for personal enrichment. So anyway, Marty, I just am so thrilled that that you joined us today, and I think part of this is, I think you and the ARC staff have a lot to share with us about the real importance and the concern that that we need to make sure that we are in fact policing ourselves.
I would like to ask Megan if she would mind unmuting again before we get to questions from all of the wonderful folks on this call. Do you have something that you'd like to share before we get to questions?
Marty, I echo Steve's sentiments. Thank you so much for your presentation today and that glimpse into the room, like Yolanda mentioned earlier, because I think for many of us, it's just, we've heard these stories throughout the years, and to really get a peek under the hood at what happened was really interesting. I would just comment that here in Colorado, we have been, we're probably on the other side of your take on 65 and older. And I think that the compromise that we have found with Medicaid is to not allow everyone over 65 to join our pooled trust, but to do that very thoughtfully and carefully with a spending plan that shows that we are going to use the person's money in their lifetime for their benefit. And that same principle has been adopted by a number of states like Minnesota and Wisconsin and Kansas, Michigan, and I'm probably not thinking of all of them. But I think it's a really good compromise and meeting in the middle to show that we can, we're not going to allow people with, the 99-year-old doctor who wants to get on Medicaid, who has $1 million. But instead, maybe somebody who's 69 and has a developmental disability and, gets a personal injury and gets $30,000. And how can we really use the trust to enrich their lives in their lifetime? So, that's what we champion for. And I think some others here who are part of APT are looking to do as well. Looks like Carrie has her hand up, so I'm going to pass the baton.
I wanted to piggyback on that. Actually, I was thinking the 65 and over also, Megan, before you talked about it. And Marty, I would like your input, because I think APT has to be, it's a lot about risk management, right? And looking at risk. So as a lot of us continue to work with the over 65 population, see the need with the 65 and over population, are you concerned that we are red flagging ourselves essentially, because that is a place where Congress didn't want this to happen? Do they even remember? But do you think that our fights for people with disabilities that are 65 and over is going to cause a potential to a desire to get rid of pooled trust altogether.
I think that's a tough one, because if you're looking at people who are entering nursing facilities, they would probably be identified as people with disabilities. So I don't know how you would distinguish them from people who would otherwise be eligible if they were under 65. So it's tough unless you're trying to single out. I mean, the people who are under 65 who don't have IDD but who are disabled are able to use the trusts also. So it becomes that's tough. I think more work would have to be done to figure that one out, because almost by definition, if you're ill enough to be in that setting, you have disabilities, even if they're temporary. So I don't think it's going to be an easy compromise, and I don't know how to address that issue at this point, but I think it's going to take some work.
I think Megan did say that we use the spending plan, right, to show that you're getting fair market value, that you're not just transferring it for Medicaid. I guess the bigger question I'm asking is it putting a target on our backs for us continuing, whether it be right or wrong morally, right, continuing to fight for people over 65 to have this advantage?
Maybe there is a compromise in there. I didn't catch the spending word from Megan. I heard bending. So sorry, that's probably because I still have this awful respiratory thing. A spending plan with a result that provides the leftover to Medicaid might be a way to go if there's an agreement that does that, so that it is not an attempt to have a loophole to get around and then have the monies go to the beneficiaries. I could see that as something that might work if there were, because it's meeting the spirit of the law. If there were, and you said, Megan, that that is something that the state Medicaid goes along with. That would seem to be something that if there were work done that CMS agreed to, that might be the way. I mean, there's no way to do this without doing some work at the national level too, because you'd have to have buy-in at the national level, I would think. I don't know how easy that would be to it's just something we'd have to think about and talk about and discuss whether you'd ever want to go for an amendment. I mean, you'd have to have the payback and all that stuff to go with it. Without it, it would be a disaster at the congressional level.
So,
but I mean, there's some rationale to that.
I think for me, and of course, if you have a question, please feel free to put your hand up. I can't see everyone, but if you want to put got a question in the chat so that I can acknowledge you and ask you to unmute. But one of the questions that I have, Marty, is not necessarily the 65 and older, because I really do think that if we as a pooled specialties trust community are set up to ensure that when someone joins, no matter their age, that we are looking at whether it's a spending plan that Megan mentioned, or some type of quality of life planning or budgeting, we're going to make sure that we are making funds available for disbursement on behalf of the people to enhance their quality of life. So I think if we're doing that, then we're covered. my concern, and I just want a little more information about one of the cautions you mentioned about the retention. We have a lot of trusts here, multiple trusts in states that have very different policies on the retention. And we have some that go back to a small percentage. We have some that are 50%, and we have some that don't retain anything, and we have some that retain 100%. As APT moves forward with trying to come up with not policies, because we're not here to police other pooled special needs trusts, but we are here to make sure that we have we're creating a best practices. And for me, the best practices, anything that will prevent Congress from coming back and shutting us down as nonprofits that serve as trustees. So can you talk a little bit more about your concerns with the retention, if there's any additional information, or if there are things that we should look at as an organization supporting pooled special needs trusts?
Well, I think that I think there are a number of areas you could ask questions. Is the retention, is it 100%? Is it being used to support other people in the trust, say those who have outlived their own funds, their actuarial life expectancy, and their spending plan? The money ran out. Are services being provided to other people, or is it only being used for administrative purposes? Is it being used, if it's used for administrative purposes, is it for the trust itself, or is it going back to a parent organization, which to me is getting a little iffy. If it's leaving the trust and going to a parent organization, that is a problem from my perspective. And the 501c aspect, or I should say the nonprofit aspect, there have been some situations where it's questionable about the practices of who has set up the nonprofit and the expertise of the people who are running it, and whether they're actually providing knowledgeable service to the individual. Are they only handling money? Are they doing anything else that is appropriate for the individuals, etc.? So there, and Steve, you may be able to talk to this some about, there were for a while concerns about law firms setting up nonprofits and running those out of the law firm. What is being done other than simply paying bills? Is anything else happening with that person? Is there any sense that the needs of the individual are being met?
Right. Well, part of this, if I get your drift on this, I attended a program shortly after Over 93 was passed with a major presenter talking to a bunch of elder law attorneys, and he basically told the elder law attorneys, you're an idiot if you don't open up a nonprofit and open up your own pooled trust. And I'm thinking, oh my God, that clearly is not what Congress intended, and that could jeopardize the entire community. Fortunately, most people didn't follow that, but there are some, and we really don't know much about it, but there are some programs that at least look like they don't really have a charitable purpose. And that's part of the concern that we have here. Once again, is Yolanda said, that we're not necessarily in the business of so far of policing our colleagues. What we are in the business of is setting up best practices, of which the amount of work that's gone into this is incredible. And we're going to start doing programs on this. And, because part of this, once again, many of the programs we run are nonprofits in their own right here, and there's not much question about it. Some programs sure look like the only reason the nonprofit is there is to serve the business of running a pooled trust. And I think those are the ones that we need to be careful about here. Does that address, and there's just so much to do here.
Yeah, I mean, because of the timing and the speed with which some of this happened in 93, there were pooled trusts that already existed, and there were charitable organizations that were running them or had spun them off into separate nonprofits, and that was just how it was done. I don't think anybody ever anticipated that people would think of other bizarre ways of doing this. So they weren't heavily described in the statutory language, and that's a problem now, because people are getting very creative about how to do some of this, and that's kind of stuff that I think will grab attention. I think you're right. Developing some best practice will be very important, because imagine the phone call from a House or Senate staffer that requests you to come and testify. What would you like to testify about? Wouldn't you like to be able to say that you work with an organization that has set up some best practice tools, and if when they start questioning you about these other things, you'd like to say, well, that wouldn't be considered acceptable in our organization, and you would have something to say if they were to say, well, shouldn't somebody be monitoring this at the federal level? Shouldn't there be an agency that says, this shouldn't exist, or this, is not appropriate, and who should be running that, and that kind of stuff? Those are questions that could easily be asked in a hearing. Shouldn't these be monitored, et cetera, et cetera, and how and by whom? So, I mean, normally that kind of thing is a state level.
These things can happen very fast.
Yeah.
It's usually an article or something along that line that happens, and which is all the more reason why we need to get our act together here, rather than be reactive when that inevitable event's going to happen. I mean, could be in a month, could be in a year, could be in 10 years, but we all deal with the long term. I mean, the other thing, part of Marty, also that we're really trying to focus on is, we're talking about stability of the program and standards, but the other part of that is to make sure that we're actually serving the people we're supposed to serve, which is, I mean, that kind of gets lost on occasion, but pooled trusts are becoming a more and more important factor. And in many cases, it's getting harder and harder to find not only trustees that will take special needs trusts, but that have the expertise in serving persons with disabilities. And, many of the folks you see right now that are representing many of the pooled trusts, they are dedicating their lives to what we should all be doing, which is to better the life of people with disabilities, to live a quality of life that, quite frankly, many of us take for granted. That's our mission. That's what we should be focused on.
Yeah.
So we do have sorry, go ahead, Marty.
No, I was just going to say, I'm drawing a blank on the Judge Kristen Glenn. I think I'm drawing a blank on her last name. Booth Glenn, or Glenn Booth, who had a case in New York, who took an attorney to task for never visiting the person whose there was an individual trust, and the person hadn't been visited in years. They just paid the bills. Those are the kinds of things also that need to be thought of, whether it's an individual trust or a pooled trust. Those kinds of things the courts may be looking at more carefully, and certainly anyone who's running a trust should be looking at those things very carefully. And I think there's much more awareness of that. And like you're saying, Steve, those it's not acceptable just to have the responsibility and not to be carrying it out.
So we are actually over time. Thank you all that were able to remain on the line. And I know that there were a couple of questions. Megan, thank you so much for sharing your email for anyone that has questions about Colorado's Medicaid spending plan process. So please feel free to reach out to Megan. And it sounds like we have a couple of questions about, how we plan to or hope to mitigate problem bad actors. Well, all I can say about that at this point is please make sure that you join APT so that you can join us in having that conversation, so that we can ensure that we are working as a collective to ensure that we are developing those best practices so that we can be there to support our neighbor across the state line. Pooled special needs trusts that may be extremely small, that are just starting, that are trying to figure things out. We have to serve as and act as a collective as we move forward. So I encourage you all to please join us. Make sure that you are part of the conversation. When we go to Stetson, we will have hopefully an opportunity for members, APT members, to join us for a dessert fellowship, so that we can have an opportunity to meet one another in person, but also have a connection or connecting with one another. Marty, thank you so much. I have a feeling that we're going to be reaching out to you again to help us as we begin to navigate some of the topics that you brought to our attention as part of your closing and options or concerns, as well as some of the other questions that folks may have had in the chat that we were unable to respond to at this point. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you for agreeing. Thank you, everybody. And if there are no other concerns or questions, we're going to say until next time, visit our website, look for the next monthly meeting. We hope to see you next month at Stetson for those that are planning to attend. Other than that, have a wonderful Pooled Special Needs Trust Day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.